I remember standing there in my ill-fitting graduation gown, the stiff black fabric digging into my shoulders, feeling like everyone's eyes were weighing me down, silently judging me. The sun was glaring, but I could barely feel its warmth because all I could feel was the gnawing anxiety curling in my stomach. I had spent the morning straightening my hair, tugging at the ends of my dress, hoping that somehow today I could vanish into the crowd and escape the scrutiny that had followed me through high school. But it was hopeless. I could see the whispers already, the sideways glances, the suppressed giggles, and I knew they were all thinking it. The ugly graduate. It wasn't a secret anymore. Everyone had decided, everyone had a verdict, and I was trapped in their cruel consensus. I tried to smile as my name was called, taking the tiny steps across the stage, but my legs felt like lead. I could hear the soft chuckles behind me and the rustle of cameras, the clicks that made my heart thump uncomfortably. I tried to pretend I didn't hear it, focusing on the diploma in the dean's hands. But every nerve in my body screamed that I didn't belong there, that I had never belonged anywhere. I caught a glimpse of my classmates, beautiful, confident, laughing with one another, and I felt the sharp, hollow ache of inadequacy. I had tried so hard. I had stayed late after class, studied every night, done everything right. And yet, here I was, judged solely for the shape of my nose, the awkwardness of my smile, the clothes I couldn't afford. I had passed every test except the one that mattered in the shallow, unfeeling eyes of everyone around me. After the ceremony, I returned home, expecting some relief in the familiar walls. But the wait only doubled. My mother was in the kitchen, folding laundry, her face a mask of mild disapproval, as if my very existence was a mistake she had to endure. My father lounged in the living room, arms crossed, silently counting every perceived flaw he had ever noticed. Neither offered a word of congratulations, no warm smile, no acknowledgement that I had just completed 12 years of effort. Instead, there was this heavy tension, this unspoken calculation of my failures. I set my diploma on the counter, trying to catch their eyes, hoping for a glimmer of pride or relief. But all I caught were shadows, cold and unyielding, mirrored in the hard lines of their faces. "Emma," my mother said finally, her voice low and sharp. "Did you even try? I mean, look at you. That gown doesn't even fit properly. And your hair? It looks like you didn't even care. Are you really proud of how you look?" Her words were a dagger, twisting in the empty space where my confidence should have been. I opened my mouth, tried to tell her that I had done my best, that I had walked across that stage, that I had graduated, but the words wouldn't form. My throat tightened, and all I could do was stare at the floor, the polished tiles reflecting my trembling hands. My father didn't even bother to look up. "It's not just about looks, Emma," he said, though his tone was dripping with scorn. "You've got no sense of ambition, no drive. You graduate, and what? You'll end up like your aunt stuck in some dead-end job, hoping someone notices you. Honestly, I'm ashamed. You've wasted everyone's time." The words were sharper than any slap. They left invisible bruises that burned through my chest. I wanted to shout, to tell him that I had dreams, that I had plans, that I had worked harder than anyone imagined. But I knew it was useless. The judgment in their eyes was absolute, and no explanation would ever be enough. I remember curling my hands into fists, nails biting into my palms until I tasted blood. I wanted to leave, to disappear from the house that had once felt like a home, to escape the faces that had turned cold with disappointment. I didn't know where to go, didn't know how to survive without them, but something inside me, an ember I hadn't realized was burning, refused to break completely. I wanted to scream, "I'm more than what you see," but the sound died in my chest. All I could manage was a whisper, almost to myself, "I'm done." It was later that night, after I had packed my things into a battered suitcase, that my mother finally let me have it all at once. "If you think you're going to make something of yourself, Emma, think again. You're ugly, unremarkable, and frankly, we're done pretending you belong here. Don't come back. Don't call. Don't think we care about your future, because clearly you're incapable of handling it." Her words reverberated in the room long after they were spoken, bouncing around in my skull and lodging themselves in my heart. My father nodded silently, a grim, approving gesture that confirmed I was truly alone. The walk to the bus stop felt surreal, the night air brushing against my tear-streaked face, carrying away the faint smell of home I would soon never know again. My mind raced with questions I had no answers to. Why had they turned on me so completely? Why had they let cruelty replace love? Why had they made me feel like nothing mattered except how I looked? Every step I took away from the house felt both terrifying and liberating, like I was stepping off a cliff into a world that didn't care whether I survived. And in a strange way, That scared me less than the thought of staying, of remaining in a place that had never truly seen me for who I was. I slept that night on a friend's couch, the thin blanket doing little to soothe the storm inside me. I couldn't stop replaying their words over and over, like a broken record looping in my mind. Ugly, unremarkable, incapable. Each word sank deeper into me. Yet underneath the pain, I felt the first flicker of defiance. I realized I didn't have to accept their definitions, their verdicts, or their limits. I was 18. Yes. And yes. I had nothing but a suitcase and a wounded heart, but I also had a pulse, a mind, and a body that could carry me forward if I dared to try. By morning, the initial shock had dulled to a dull ache, and I started to plan, almost instinctively, how to survive, how to build a life without them. The world felt enormous, intimidating, and full of unknowns, but it also held the tiniest spark of possibility. For the first time, I understood that my family's rejection didn't have to define me. I would carry their words as fuel rather than chains. That day, as I boarded the bus to the city, clutching my small suitcase and my fragile, bruised heart, I made a silent vow. I would survive, and I would prove that my worth was not theirs to decide. I cried again on the bus, unashamed, letting the tears fall freely, unguarded. And even though the tears were bitter and my hands shook from exhaustion, a small, stubborn ember of hope burned quietly inside me. I didn't know what the future held. I didn't know if I would fail or succeed. But I knew one thing. For the first time in my life, I was truly alone, and for the first time, I felt the strange, terrifying freedom that came with that. The freedom to be me. The first few months after leaving home were a blur of exhaustion, anxiety, and tiny victories that felt monumental in their significance. I moved into a cramped studio apartment on the edge of the city, a place where the walls were thin and the paint chipped, but it was minor at least, mine for the moment. The smell of damp carpet and stale air was almost comforting in its familiarity. It reminded me that I was alive, that I had chosen this life, however uncertain it was. I spent hours staring at the ceiling some nights, trying to decide which job to take first. I didn't have a plan, really, just a stubborn determination to survive and the faint, shaky idea that I deserved more than the judgment I had left behind. I started working at a small cafe, the kind where the regulars had names I could barely remember but faces I could recognize. My boss, a wiry man named George, had a kind of gruff patience that made the long, exhausting shifts bearable. I would mop floors until my arms ached, wipe down counters until my knuckles turned white, all the while feeling the persistent sting of comparison in the back of my mind. Every beautiful barista with perfect teeth and effortless hair made me flinch, reminded me of the high school girl who had been mocked relentlessly. But the work, grueling and unglamorous, offered a strange sense of control. I could do my best, and no one could take that away from me. Outside of work, loneliness wrapped itself around me like a second skin. Some nights I went days without seeing another person, my only companions being the buzzing fluorescent lights and the faint hum of the city outside my window. I would make small phone calls to distant friends, people I barely knew but who somehow offered a tether to normalcy. One of them, a girl named Marcy, became my lifeline. She was messy, loud, imperfect in ways that didn't scare me. And she had a way of laughing that made the world feel a little less threatening. We would sit on my rickety couch with takeout boxes balanced on our knees, talking for hours about everything and nothing. And in those moments, I started to feel like I belonged somewhere again, if only temporarily. Money was always tight, tighter than I expected, and the anxiety of it gnawed at me constantly. There were nights I went without proper meals, nights I slept with the heat off to save money, nights when the bills stacked up and I felt the panic rise in my chest until I could hardly breathe. And yet, amidst all that fear, there were these small victories. I learned to budget, to stretch a paycheck, to find satisfaction in doing more with less. I started to take pride in my independence, in the fact that I wasn't running back home to my parents, even if every instinct screamed that I should. Each day I managed to survive, to keep the apartment, to show up for work. Felt like a quiet triumph over the years of ridicule and rejection. Slowly, I began to invest in myself in ways both small and meaningful. I signed up for night classes at the local community college, tentatively at first, unsure if I belonged in a classroom full of strangers with sharp eyes and sharper intellects. But the more I attended, the more I realized that my mind was capable of learning, capable of contributing, capable of achieving in ways my parents had never allowed themselves to imagine. I threw myself into reading, into writing late-night journal entries, into learning to cook meals that didn't taste like desperation. Each skill, each accomplishment, no matter how minor, chipped away at the insecurity that had taken root in my high school years. Friendship became my anchor. Fragile but essential. Marcy introduced me to a small circle of people who were bruised and scarred in ways similar to mine, people who had been overlooked, underestimated, or abandoned. And there was a healing power in that shared understanding. We celebrated birthdays quietly, went on late-night walks through empty streets, drank cheap wine on concrete steps, and laughed until our stomachs hurt. There was no judgment here, no cruel comparisons, no whispered nicknames to haunt our nights. For the first time in a long time, I felt like I could breathe without holding back. It was messy and imperfect, but it was mine. Despite these small joys, doubt was never far behind. Every time I passed a mirror, every time I saw a social media post from someone I used to know, every time I remembered the words of my parents, a sharp pang of inadequacy returned. I wondered if I would ever be enough, if I would ever be beautiful or successful, if anyone could ever care for me in a world that had so clearly rejected me. Nights of tears came often, and I allowed them. Let them fall freely, let them remind me that pain didn't mean weakness. Slowly, though, I realized that pain didn't have to define my life. It could be a guide, a map of where I had been, pointing toward where I wanted to go. Work, school, and friends became a rhythm, a life that was mine to navigate. I started setting goals. First small, then ambitious. I saved what little money I could for a better apartment, for books, for classes that would challenge me. I learned to speak up in group discussions, to voice my opinions, to argue for myself in ways that would have terrified the 18-year-old girl still reeling from graduation. Each step, each decision, was an assertion of my independence, a rebellion against the narrative my parents had written for me, a refusal to stay small, unseen, and unheard. Romantic life, tentative and awkward at first, became another arena of self-discovery. I went on dates that were uncomfortable and thrilling, sometimes disappointing, sometimes exhilarating. Each interaction taught me about boundaries, about desire, about the subtle power of being unapologetically myself. For the first time, I could imagine intimacy without shame, connection without judgment, and it felt like a revelation that slowly stitched together the holes my parents' cruelty had left behind. I was learning to love in a world that had once made me feel unworthy. And that was as transformative as any academic achievement or financial milestone by the end of the first year. I had survived, truly survived, and it felt almost miraculous. I had friends who would stay up late listening to me cry. Jobs that, while exhausting, made me feel capable, and a growing sense of self that was beginning to take root in my heart. The girl who had left home with a suitcase full of doubts was not gone, but she was evolving, becoming someone stronger, more resilient, and quietly defiant. I understood now that my family's rejection had carved a path for me I would never have chosen willingly, but one that was teaching me lessons about courage, resilience, and self-worth, even in the darkest moments. When loneliness and fear threatened to swallow me whole, I could feel that ember burning inside the one that had first sparked on the night I left home. It was small, fragile, and easily smothered, but it was alive. I began to imagine a future where I was not just surviving, but thriving, where the pain of the past could become a distant echo instead of a constant reminder. And though I didn't yet know how I would get there, I felt for the first time a flicker of something daring and intoxicating: hope. Over the next few years, I changed in ways I could hardly recognize if I looked at old photos. The timid, self-conscious girl who had clutched a suitcase and cried on a friend's couch had transformed into someone with a spine of steel and a quiet confidence that radiated in small, subtle ways. I had finished my degree, a long-awaited culmination of late nights, skipped weekends, and relentless determination. The satisfaction wasn't in the diploma itself, it was in what it represented. Proof that I could endure, that I could thrive without anyone's approval. I walked across stages again in my mind, but this time I remembered not the whispers and laughter, but the pride that filled me quietly. The knowledge that I had conquered the doubts that had once threatened to swallow me whole. My work life began to reflect this transformation as well. I secured a position at a small but respected firm, one that recognized diligence and talent rather than appearance or family connections. I threw myself into projects with a focus that was almost obsessive, driven not by desperation but by a need to prove to myself that I was capable of achieving excellence on my own terms. Meetings that would have once terrified me became arenas in which I shone, where ideas were valued and my voice carried weight. The quiet confidence I had cultivated over the years manifested in subtle ways: the steady tone of my emails, the careful clarity of my presentations, the small, measured gestures in conversation. I was no longer invisible. I was seen. My appearance, once the source of relentless self-criticism, became an expression of identity rather than a mark of shame. I experimented with clothing that made me feel powerful, hairstyles that framed my face instead of hiding it, makeup that enhanced features I had once loathed. Each small adjustment was a statement. I was learning to embrace myself, to define beauty on my own terms rather than submitting to the cruel measurements of others. I began to notice people looking at me differently. The brief admiration in a stranger's glance, the subtle respect from colleagues who had only known my work ethic, not my past. These moments, fleeting though they were, added layers to the fortress of self-esteem I was building. I realized slowly and almost reluctantly that the world was noticing me in ways my family never had or perhaps had refused to. Romantic life took a parallel path, evolving with the growing confidence I carried like armor. I met people who were genuinely interested in who I was, not who I had been told to be. There was laughter, awkwardness, and vulnerability in these connections. Moments that reminded me that intimacy could be safe and beautiful. My heart, once hardened by rejection, had softened with the realization that affection could exist without judgment, without the cruelty of those who had dismissed me. I allowed myself to care, to be cared for, and to trust that my worth wasn't contingent on someone else's approval. I still carried scars, yes, but they were reminders of survival, not shackles of shame. As my personal and professional life flourished, memories of my family's words began to resurface, often at unexpected moments. I would catch a reflection of myself in a store window and hear my mother's voice whispering, "Ugly, unremarkable, incapable," or recall my father's cold dismissal. The sting remained, but it had transformed into something sharper, something that no longer crippled me but instead fueled me. I found myself oscillating between anger, disbelief, and a reluctant pity for the people who had once held such power over me. Their rejection had defined my past, but it no longer dictated my present. In these reflections, I recognized the bitter irony. They had tried to diminish me, but in the process, they had forced me to grow, to fight, to build a life that was authentically mine. By this point, my social circle had also evolved into a chosen family of sorts, people who had witnessed my growth, who celebrated achievements both small and monumental, who offered comfort in moments of doubt. We attended dinner parties, weekend trips, and casual coffee dates, laughing over past mistakes, sharing triumphs, and quietly supporting one another through the uncertainties of life. These relationships reinforced the truth that belonging was not something one earned through appearance or bloodline, but something cultivated through trust, loyalty, and shared experiences. I had learned a profound lesson: that family wasn't only what you were born into, it could be what you built, piece by careful piece. The transformation wasn't just internal, it manifested in public ways that surprised even me. One evening, at a company gala, I noticed my former high school classmates in the crowd. They had aged, of course, but the echoes of their teenage arrogance were faintly visible in their postures and glances. I watched carefully as some of them did double takes, whispering among themselves, and I felt a quiet, simmering satisfaction. I didn't approach them, didn't need to. My presence, my poise, and the subtle confidence that radiated from me spoke louder than words ever could. I had changed the narrative, not through confrontation, but through living fully, unapologetically, and successfully. Despite all the external changes, the internal journey was ongoing. Some mornings I still woke with the residue of old fears, the faint tremor of doubt, and the creeping worry that the world would reject me just as my family had. But I had learned tools, strategies, and rituals to steady myself: journaling, meditation, late-night walks, and the gentle reminder that survival itself was a triumph. I was no longer defined by cruelty, by mockery, by whispered names in hallways. I was defined by resilience, ambition, and the quiet elegance of knowing that I had carved a life from fragments of pain. In small, private moments, I sometimes imagined returning to my hometown, walking down streets that once seemed suffocating, seeing the houses and faces that had once been both familiar and oppressive. I imagined standing tall, not to gloat or provoke, but simply to exist as someone fully formed, someone who had grown beyond the limitations imposed by others. These thoughts were both thrilling and terrifying. I wasn't seeking revenge. Exactly, I was seeking closure, the rare and difficult kind that comes from witnessing your own growth, not from forcing repentance in others. And yet, even as I thrived, there remained a quiet, persistent curiosity about the family that had once disowned me. I wondered, not always willingly, what had become of them, whether they had ever paused to think of me, whether they noticed the absence of the child they had cast aside. The questions hovered unresolved, like shadows at the edges of my mind, reminding me that transformation is rarely linear and that success does not erase pain entirely. But now, unlike before, I had a choice in how to engage with those questions. I could confront, ignore, or reflect. I could define the terms of my life, rather than having them dictated by cruelty and rejection. Looking back on the decade that had passed, I recognized the stark contrast between the frightened, aching girl I had once been and the woman I had become. The journey had been long, messy, and often unbearably painful, but it had shaped me into someone unrecognizable to my former self in all the best ways. I was strong, resilient, and fully capable of creating a life that mattered. I had learned to navigate failure, loneliness, and rejection, transforming each into a stepping stone rather than a stumbling block. And for the first time in years, I felt that I had truly arrived at a place where my worth was mine to define, and mine alone. Returning to my hometown after nearly a decade felt like stepping into a photograph where all the colors had shifted, where familiar streets seemed narrower, and where the echoes of old voices lingered in the air. I parked near the coffee shop I used to haunt as a teenager, the one where I had once nursed heartbreaks and daydreamed about a life I thought would never arrive. The building had changed, the signage slightly brighter, but the memories clung stubbornly, tugging at me like invisible hands. I took a deep breath, feeling the tremor of nerves I hadn't expected, and reminded myself that this time, I wasn't the scared girl who had left with nothing but a suitcase. I was Emma, and I had lived, survived, and grown beyond the narrow definitions of the people I once feared. The reunion was held in a small banquet hall that smelled faintly of flowers and old carpeting, a setting simultaneously mundane and loaded with significance. Walking in, I immediately noticed faces frozen in the same expressions I remembered from high school: smug, curious, slightly anxious. Some didn't recognize me at first, and the hesitation in their eyes as recognition dawned was almost delicious. I felt no need to gloat. I didn't need them to acknowledge my success. The weight of my presence alone, the aura of self-possession, was enough to communicate that I had moved past the cruel judgment that had once defined me. I could see the brief flicker of surprise, the involuntary straightening of posture, the whispers that traveled too quickly to contain themselves. And then there was my family. My parents were there, of course, seated at the head table, expressions carefully measured, like statues carved to project dignity while hiding uncertainty. My mother's lips were pressed tight, a habitual shield against emotion, while my father's eyes darted briefly toward me, betraying a flicker of recognition that his mind immediately tried to dismiss. My chest tightened at the sight, the old ache of abandonment returning with a vengeance. I wanted to rush toward them, demand answers, scream at them for the years of pain they had caused, but I forced myself to breathe, to wait, to observe. This time, I held the power. Not because of malice, but because of control over my own story. I made my way through the room, exchanging polite greetings with former classmates. Small talk that felt strangely performative. Some were cautiously complimentary, noting my appearance, my achievements, the confidence in my voice. I smiled politely, nodding, offering kind words. But inside, I measured each interaction with careful detachment. The girl they had mocked, the one they had labeled ugly and unworthy, had returned not to beg for approval, but to exist as someone fully realized. I noticed subtle attempts to diminish me, slight understatements, indirect references to my past, but they barely grazed me. I had grown too much, had faced far harsher judgments, to be unsettled by the faint echo of adolescent cruelty. When my mother finally approached, the moment was electric, charged with unspoken tension. Her eyes flickered with a mixture of disbelief, guilt, and something I couldn't quite name. "Emma," she said, voice unusually soft, almost hesitant. "You've changed." I held her gaze, seeing for the first time that recognition of what she had missed came too late. "I had too," I replied, calm, steady, the words carrying a weight that felt satisfying. I didn't need to elaborate, didn't need to justify the years of survival, struggle, and growth. My life was mine, my accomplishments mine, and her acknowledgement, though perhaps sincere, didn't alter the past. My father hovered nearby, silent at first, then interjecting with a clipped, almost offensive tone. "You've certainly improved," he said, the words awkward, clumsy, as if he were testing whether his approval might still hold any power over me. I studied him, noting the lines etched by years of stubborn pride, and replied evenly, "I've lived my life. Dad, it wasn't easy, but I'm here, and I'm not asking for anything from anyone," he faltered. The words he had wielded as weapons for so long, now powerless. I realized then that the confrontation I had feared wasn't about winning or proving them wrong. It was about witnessing their recognition of my independence and understanding that their control had ended. Other classmates approached, some hesitant, some emboldened by curiosity. They complimented my appearance, my career, my accomplishments. Though I could tell the admiration was mixed with surprise and lingering doubt, I responded with polite smiles, light conversation, careful not to indulge in gloating, letting my demeanor speak louder than words ever could. The power dynamics had shifted entirely, and I felt a profound satisfaction in the subtle dominance of authenticity. I was no longer subject to their judgment. I was an observer of how surprised they were to see someone they had underestimated thrive. There was a moment later, as I stepped outside for a breath of evening air, that the floodgates of memory opened. I remembered the cruel laughter in the hallways, the whispered nicknames, the sharp sting of my parents' disapproval. For a moment I felt the weight of the years fall back onto me, the familiar ache of being unseen and unloved. But I steadied myself, remembering how far I had come, the battles I had fought alone, the victories I had claimed with effort and resilience. I let a quiet pride settle into my chest, a recognition that survival, perseverance, and authenticity had carved me into someone untouchable by the judgments of my past. A few classmates approached me with tentative apologies, awkward and stilted, trying to bridge years of distance with words that felt insufficient. I accepted them politely, nodding, acknowledging that people could change. But I didn't let it affect the calm confidence I carried. Forgiveness was optional, and in that moment, I realized it was unnecessary for my sense of peace. What mattered was my own growth, my own resilience, and the way I had defined my worth, independent of the approval I had once sought. The encounter, while emotionally charged, reinforced the central truth. I was no longer subject to anyone else's narrative. That, as the night wound down, I walked alone through the familiar streets, the cool air brushing my face, feeling a sense of liberation that was both exhilarating and strangely tender. I thought of the girl I had once been, the one who had carried a suitcase and tears across the city, and I allowed myself to feel pride in her bravery. She had endured, had fought, had become someone who could return to the places that once felt suffocating and stand tall without flinching. The town hadn't changed, not entirely, but I had, and that made all the difference. The drive back to my apartment later that night was quiet, the streets dimly lit and familiar, and I allowed myself to reflect on the lessons I had learned. Strength wasn't about revenge or forcing recognition or proving others wrong. It was about living fully, authentically, and without reliance on external validation. My family's cruelty had shaped me, yes, but it hadn't destroyed me. It had created the conditions for resilience, courage, and self-definition. I had confronted the echoes of my past, not with bitterness, but with a quiet, unshakable authority that came from living, thriving, and refusing to be diminished. That night, alone in my apartment, I let the weight of the reunion settle. There were still unresolved feelings, lingering questions, and the occasional ache of old wounds, but they no longer controlled me. I had stood in the presence of the people who had once judged me, who had doubted me, and I had done so with grace, strength, and self-respect. The journey had been long, harrowing, and transformative, and I felt the deep, satisfying sense of closure that comes not from apology or reconciliation, but from recognition of one's own growth. I was no longer defined by cruelty or rejection. I was defined by survival, resilience, and the quiet triumph of living fully on my own terms. The weeks after the reunion were quieter, a strange, reflective calm that settled over me like a soft blanket. I found myself revisiting moments in my mind, replaying conversations, gestures, and the subtle shifts in expressions I had noticed. My parents' stiff acknowledgement, the hesitation of former classmates, the flicker of surprise that passed too quickly for them to conceal it, all lingered in my thoughts. Yet, instead of stirring resentment or grief, these memories began to feel like markers of distance I had traveled. They were reminders of a time when I had been small, voiceless, and defined by the cruelty of others. And now, standing here, I could measure the vastness of the journey I had undertaken. I realized that closure wasn't about changing the past or extracting apologies. It was about witnessing my own growth, my resilience, and the life I had built despite everything that tried to hold me back. One afternoon, I received a tentative call from my mother. Her voice was low, almost uncertain, and I could hear the hesitation beneath her words. Emma, I wanted to say that I'm proud of you. I know it may not mean much after everything, but I see what you've accomplished. I paused, listening, the room quiet around me. The words weren't perfect, and they weren't the heartfelt, healing confession I had sometimes imagined in my darkest nights. But they weren't meant to be. They were an acknowledgement, small and imperfect, and that was enough. I replied calmly, "Thank you, Mom. I hope you're well." There was no need for more. I didn't need her pride to validate my life. It was already fully validated by my own hands, my own heart. I spent the following days reflecting on what forgiveness meant in my life. I realized it wasn't about excusing past cruelty or pretending it hadn't hurt me. It was about releasing the power that bitterness still held over me. I allowed myself to feel compassion for my parents, not because they had earned it, but because I had earned the peace that came with it. Holding on to anger had been natural and necessary for survival, but now it felt like a weight I no longer needed to carry. I could acknowledge their flaws without letting them define my worth. And that simple realization filled me with a profound sense of freedom. In the quiet moments of my apartment, I thought about the girl I had once been, the insecure Emma who had left home with tears and a suitcase, and I felt a wave of pride so fierce it caught me off guard. She had survived. She had built a life out of nothing but determination, courage, and resilience. I remembered the nights I had cried alone, the endless hours spent working, studying, learning, and fighting for a place where I could simply exist without judgment. All of it had led to this moment, a life fully my own, rich with relationships, accomplishments, and the uncheckable confidence that comes from knowing I could weather any storm. I started to reconnect with the people who had stood by me during my darkest times. Marcy, who had been my anchor in those early months, came over one evening, a bottle of wine in hand, and we sat on my balcony, watching the city lights twinkle like distant stars. We laughed over memories of our struggles, our awkward dates, and the times we had convinced ourselves the world would never recognize our worth. We toasted silently to survival, to growth, and to the future one that we would shape ourselves unburdened by the ghosts of judgment. It was a small celebration, intimate and tender, but it was emblematic of a life I had consciously chosen, one of joy, resilience, and self-determined connection where it continued to flourish. And I began mentoring younger colleagues, sharing not just technical skills, but lessons learned about resilience, self-confidence, and perseverance. I found joy in guiding others through challenges I had once faced, offering support in ways I had once longed for myself. It became clear that my journey, filled with hardship and triumph, had equipped me with a depth of empathy and understanding that few could teach. I was not just surviving, I was thriving, building a life that radiated stability, confidence, and the quiet authority of someone who had been forged in adversity. One day, I found myself walking past my old high school, curiosity and nostalgia pulling me forward. The walls were freshly painted, the halls bustling with students, laughter, and energy. For a moment, I paused at the entrance, feeling the weight of history, of all the moments I had endured within these walls. And yet, instead of anger, I felt a quiet peace. The halls no longer held power over me. The whispers, the cruel laughter, the judgment that had once defined mythos, ghosts had no hold here. I was free to walk through them as a stranger, fully unburdened, fully myself. A letter arrived that same week from my father. I hadn't expected it, and I opened it with a mix of apprehension and curiosity. Inside, he wrote a simple note. "Emma, I have reflected on the past and recognized that we failed you in ways we cannot undo. I am proud of the woman you have become. I hope you continue to thrive." The words stirred something deep in me, not bitterness, not resentment, not a need for validation, but a serene acknowledgement that the distance between us could now exist without pain. I wrote back a brief, composed note, expressing gratitude without apology, closing that chapter on my terms. The act of responding calmly, without anger or pleading, cemented a sense of completion I had long sought. In the evenings, I allowed myself to envision a future unshackled from old wounds. I imagined new adventures, relationships, and achievements, feeling the thrill of possibility without the shadow of past judgment. I began planning a small trip, something I had postponed for years, imagining the freedom of exploring the world on my own terms. The thrill of autonomy, of possibility, and of the life I had fought so hard to create filled me with a radiant sense of hope. I understood with clarity that the journey was ongoing, but for the first time, The road ahead felt open, expansive, and full of potential, and in quiet, solitary moments. I would sometimes glance at myself in the mirror and allow a soft smile. The reflection staring back was a woman who had endured cruelty, rejection, and heartbreak, yet had emerged resilient, capable, and unafraid to define her own worth. She was no longer the ugly high school graduate whispered about in corridors. She was someone wholly her own, shaped not by the limitations others imposed, but by the courage, resilience, and determination she had carried through 10 long, transformative years. There was beauty in that survival, in that growth, in that unshakable sense of self that radiated quietly, powerfully, and finally, without apology. The decade-long journey had left scars. Yes, but they were not chains, they were evidence of survival. Badges of honor for a life reclaimed. I had learned that closure wasn't about changing the past, nor was it about winning the acknowledgement of those who had cast me aside. It was about embracing my own story, holding my life in my hands, and living it fully and authentically. I felt an almost dizzying sense of triumph, a quiet elation that came not from recognition, but from knowing that I had become exactly the person I was meant to be. That night, as I stood by the window, looking out over the city that had once been intimidating, lonely, and vast, I allowed myself a rare moment of pure, unfiltered gratitude. I had survived abandonment, cruelty, and rejection. I had fought for every inch of confidence, every ounce of self-worth, every moment of joy. I had become more than the sum of my pain, more than the labels thrust upon me, and more than anyone had dared to expect. And in that quiet triumph, I knew with certainty that I had finally come home, not to a house, a town, or a family, but to myself.